Hello and welcome to the Philosophising in podcast, a series of interviews about philosophy and lesser studied languages. Each episode, we speak with a different philosopher from around the world, examining the philosophical culture of a particular language. I'm your host, Jonathan Egged of King's College London, and today it's a real pleasure for me to be speaking with a good friend of mine, Dr. Fasil Merawi of Addis Ababa University in Ethiopia. Hello, Fasil.
Hello, Jonathan. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. I'm very well. I wanted to start off our conversation today by reflecting a little bit on the university that you work in and where you hosted me earlier on in this year, and to talk about the really interesting linguistic background and framework of Ethiopian philosophy. So the language we're talking about today is Amharic. It's the vernacular that everyone speaks in the street in Addis Ababa. And you mentioned to me before that there's a sense in which it's one of only three languages of philosophy in Ethiopia, at least three. So could you tell me about those three that you had in mind?
Amharic is the popular language that is being utilized within the popular discourse and within everyday conversations and the attempt to popularize philosophy into the masses. To such an extent, Amharic occupies a huge role. And if you look at most of the works dealing with the issues of philosophy that are published and are easily circulated, they have been published through the usage of the Amharic language. And mostly the literature that is produced in Amharic language and deals with philosophical content is characterized by two major things. One, it is not produced by academic philosophers, but different people from various backgrounds, like journalists, who
Mhm.
have an aim of selling philosophy like a commodity to the masses. And secondly, you could see that this attempt led into the popularization of Eastern philosophy and the emergence of thinkers like Osho and also different texts dealing with Eastern philosophy and meditation. And through the usage of the Amharic language, you have this attempt to develop a kind of an equivalent version of a pop psychology, sort of a pop philosophy to the masses, which does not lead into the development of a real philosophical discourse, since it is primarily motivated by the need to sell philosophy books to the masses. So Amharic certainly occupies a huge role in the attempt to popularize philosophy. So that's just one of the major expressions of philosophy in Ethiopia. This academic tradition of philosophy that is dominated by the continental tradition. And this goes back into the introduction of Marxist Leninist philosophy within the Derg period. And ever since then, there is this obsession with the usage of philosophy as a way of transforming the society and developing an emancipatory practice, and also sort of diagnosing the existential predicaments which are arising within a given society. So that is the second major form of expression. And thirdly, Ethiopian philosophy is also expressed through the usage of the Ge'ez language. And in such a context, you have the attempt to study the religious texts and the foundations of Ethiopian philosophy. And you have this attempt to popularize different texts like the Hatatas as belonging into another component of Ethiopian philosophy.
Fantastic. So it's a really interesting and unusual sort of split between the different sort of philosophical worlds, I guess. So you're saying that Amharic then is a kind of popularized way of doing philosophy. You mentioned that there's often kind of philosophy as self-help things almost, philosophy as these kind of, Eastern spiritual traditions, which get translated into Amharic. Then on the other hand, we've got, I guess you were saying, the academic style of philosophy, which is done in English. And then finally, we have the sort of the church-based tradition, which comes in Ge'ez. And that's quite interesting then that you have kind of, the one popular one in the vernacular, and then not just like one classical language like you used to have maybe with Latin in Europe or with Sanskrit in India, but you actually have two, a kind of a traditional holy language of Goethe and then the sort of contemporary academic one of English. I was just wondering, could you tell me a bit more, first of all, about the use of English then? You said it's an academic one. Is that what's used for teaching in your work at the university?
Yes, yes. If you look at the courses that are being given in our university, not just the philosophy department, but the university at large, the English is the official form of instruction within the academic context. And except some few departments like the Afan Oromo, the Amharic, and the Tigrinya departments, all of the other courses within the natural and the social sciences are being given through the usage of the English language, and particularly within the Department of Philosophy, starting out with this experimentation in the ancient period in philosophy, starting out with the pre-Socratics, going into the medieval period, the modern period, and currently the postmodern literature.
Fantastic. It's a really, really interesting kind of sociological case, I guess, of the three different languages working all alongside each other. And it's interesting, of course, that these different languages have such different focuses, not necessarily due to anything in particular about the way those languages work themselves, but about the particular social roles that they play, either as something which is connecting Ethiopia to a part of its religious past or to a contemporary global modernity or to people's everyday lives in some way. And I guess what I wanted to ask you about now is a special and an interesting text, which is how we originally started talking about these issues. A text which exists, I know, in all three of these different languages, which is the Hatata Zera Yacob. So the Hatata Zera Yacob is originally written in Ge'ez, so it's part of this third tradition you were talking about. It's rooted in church traditions and the like. And in the 20th and 21st century, it's been translated both into Amharic and into English. And I thought this was an interesting case to talk about because, as some of our listeners might know, this is a really controversial text in that people have argued that rather than being the authentic work of a 17th century Ethiopian scholar, it may have actually been forged hundreds of years later by an Italian monk. And one of the things that you and me have spoken about a few times is whether the question of forgery is necessarily such an important one for understanding the text, given that the work is importantly Ethiopian in that it is written in an Ethiopian language. And I just wondered whether you wanted to say anything in particular about the kind of linguistic background of the Hatata Zera Yacob.
Yeah, as you know, previously I used to hold the opinion that the Hatata Zera Yacob and Walde Hiyot constitutes one of the foundations of heritage Ethiopian philosophy. But recently, I think we need to reconsider such a position, especially in light of the fact that there are certain similarities between the personality and the life of Gusto d'Urbino and the persons that are presented in the name of Zera Yacob and Walde Hiyot in the texts. But even taking aside the debate on the nature of the authorship, I think the Hatata Zera Yacob and Walde Hiyot, these are important texts. And as you said, the fact that these texts have appeared through the usage of the Amharic, the English, and originally in the Ge'ez texts shows just how important they are. And I think rather than simply situating the debate on the nature of the authorship, we need to situate the broader context within which these texts originated. But we definitely need to carry out a detailed discussion, one regarding the nature of the authorship, and secondly, whether or not these texts actually constitute works of philosophy after all.
Sure, and I can highly recommend to all of our readers a couple of Fasil's papers, which you can find easily online on these topics, and also some other podcasts which were put together based on the Zera Yacob conference that happened in Oxford last year. There are multiple talks from both Ethiopian and European and American scholars on exactly that sort of topic. So if that interested you and there was some of the context that you felt was missing, I'd highly recommend some of those. So I was just asking a little bit about the teaching in the universities, right? So you mentioned that most of the teaching at the university takes place in English. Now, is the thought there so that the ideas can be shared in the widest possible community, so the Ethiopian scholars can be part of a global conversation?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at currently the way in which philosophy is being taught and practiced within the Ethiopian soil, it is mostly being dominated by continental philosophy.
Hmm.
And philosophy is being used as part of a discourse on social activism. And this interest in continental philosophy especially developed as a way of using philosophy in order to bring a real transformation in the lives of the masses. So the
Hmm.
way in which philosophy is being taught within the academia, it has a sort of a Marxist orientation
Hmm.
that goes back into the Ethiopian students movement and the equation of philosophy with Marxist thinking
Yeah.
within the Derg period. And that is still lingering within contemporary Ethiopian philosophy, since an interest is not given to the pursuit of philosophy for its own sake, and rather it is being used as a way of bringing change in the lives of the people.
Interesting. So it sounds like there are two very large background influences, I suppose, on Ethiopian philosophy that you've mentioned already. One of them is the importance of the legacy of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and of religious life in Ethiopia on the one hand, which you were mentioning can make sometimes a separation between religious and political discourses difficult to come by. And then on the other hand, there is the philosophical legacy of communism and of Marxist-Leninist sort of thinking. So would you say that these are things that make philosophy difficult in Ethiopia and inhibit them? Or would you say that these are maybe themselves two of the most important philosophical traditions that
Yeah,
have been expanded on?
I think I would say that primarily the need to identify the essence of contemporary Ethiopian philosophy should concern itself with two things. One, it is a discourse that is still being mapped out, and to such an extent, it does not have a unique essence, and it is still being figured out in its experimentation with different grounds of truth. And secondly, in terms of the different influences that you have mentioned, I would say that Ethiopian philosophy developed in an entanglement with both domestic and also external sources of philosophizing. And on one hand, you have this reflection on culture, society, and indigenous texts that have mostly originated within the church tradition. And on the other hand, as part of the religious tradition, there is also a history of a rich experimentation with the Arabian world and also the Greco-Roman civilization. So it emerged as a result of all of these influences.
Fascinating. So I was wondering, given that there are all of these different traditions that have kind of fed into the sort of the contemporary state of play in Ethiopian philosophy now, and given that it seems to be your conviction that this is still something which is in the making, right? Which reminds me of that wonderful line of Polan Huntunji where he's talking about African philosophy, right? And he says that African philosophy is still in the making. I mean, is
Mhm.
that something you'd agree with? In the
Definitely.
Ethiopian case, absolutely. Um,
Absolutely. I mean, so far, the many attempts to popularize philosophy in Ethiopia are characterized by severe limitations. On one hand, you have these attempts to romanticize the past and make it seem as if we have this rich philosophical tradition that is comparable to systems of rationality that have originated in Western Europe. But we do not have any conclusive evidence in order to make such a comparison. Again, other limitations include simply conceiving philosophy as a discourse that is a tool for societal transformation, and thereby separating its impact in terms of the quest for knowledge. So I would say that Ethiopian philosophy so far has not assumed its unique essence, and there is still an experimentation with different traditions and schools of thought.
I was interested in what you were saying about the idea of popularizing particular philosophical ideas in Amharic, in particular if you're popularizing some of the work that you do on philosophy originally in English, and what some of the challenges might be when you're trying to translate a certain set of ideas. I know you're very interested in Habermas, for example. What's it like trying to teach Habermas in Amharic?
I mean, the major challenge, not just in teaching Habermas in Amharic, but philosophy at large, is one, the fact that we do not seem to have an elaborated conception of the public sphere. And because of that, we do not have this medium and a public space where, ideas are being debated, and some of the most fundamental concepts and notions in the life of the society are not being debated. So the fact that we do not have an elaborated conception of the public sphere essentially inhibits the very development of philosophy in Ethiopia. Secondly, the way in which philosophy has been popularized within the Ethiopian context so far, it seems as if we are not able to attain this distinction between the religious sphere on one hand and the public sphere on the other hand. And because of that, philosophizing is still being perceived as a taboo. And because of that, you are not able to raise questions regarding the existence of God, the foundation of societal values, the essence of morality, and so on. On the other side, we also need to consider how there was an experimentation with different modes of philosophizing within the Ethiopian context. And particularly during the Derg period, philosophy was essentially equated with a Marxist-Leninist discourse. And because of that, the very idea of philosophizing is being identified with a radicalist discourse that seeks to undermine the foundations of societal values. And on top of that, more recently, within the last 1 or 2 decades, the attempts to introduce philosophy in Ethiopia mostly concentrated on a kind of an intellectual sophism, because you have all these journalists and individuals coming from different disciplines, simply taking the ideas of the greatest philosophers and say what they have said about religion, love, aesthetics, and so on, and using those ideas in order to sell their books to the masses, rather than having an interest in initiating a rational discourse within the society.
Interesting then. So would you say that a lot of these early attempts to do philosophy in Amharic end up sort of being these journalistic pieces in which people are kind of paraphrasing other ideas rather than trying to sort of, philosophize in Amharic?
Definitely, I agree with that. I mean, one example that you could use in order to strengthen this fact is the fact that within the Ethiopian soil, so far, the most popular thinker who's known by the masses, or at least those who have an interest in philosophy, is this person called Osho. And we know that there is an interest in yoga, in Eastern philosophy, and so on. But some of the journalists deliberately popularized the idea that philosophy is otherworldly, and it needs to be defined narrowly in relation to meditation, the negation of the material world, and so on. So the only thinkers that have caused quite a stir and a discussion are those like Osho, dealing with meditation, or even more recently, there was an attempt to introduce the ideas of Ayn Rand. But this is an attempt that is simply driven by the attempt to sell books for the masses, and it does not have any real foundation within the life of the community.
That's interesting. I do remember in the bookstores outside of Addis Ababa University, I was surprised at how many different editions of these other sort of spiritualist thinkers you could find. But I wanted to talk about what I thought was a very interesting alternative to that. So a mutual friend of ours, a scholar who has written books on philosophy in Amharic, Bruce Mara, set up something called the Zera Yacob School of Philosophy, in which teaching, as far as I can tell, took place in Amharic. Could you tell me a little bit about that institution?
Yeah, I think that is a brave attempt to introduce philosophy in Ethiopia. And this is an attempt that needs to be appreciated because it is not just oriented towards a particular philosophical tradition. And what Baruch tried to accomplish is every summer he would invite philosophy lecturers, instructors who have an interest in a wide range of topics like aesthetics, the question of modernity, philosophy of science, and so on. And those instructors would just give lectures to students who have an interest in philosophy and are coming from different backgrounds. So I myself, I have participated in 2 or 3 of those sessions, and it is a really stimulating experience where you get to have a dialogue with individuals from different disciplines and intellectual backgrounds. So that is one way of popularizing philosophy in Ethiopia.
Exactly. And that seems a really interesting one in that instead of having to translate ideas from another language into Amharic terms, we simply have people who speak this language every day doing their philosophical work in that language. So that seems like a really interesting alternative. So I found what you said about the Zera Yacob School of Philosophy and your project of presenting your academic research to audiences in Amharic to be really interesting. So I was just wondering, who were the audiences of these classes at the Zera Yacob School of Philosophy?
So essentially, what Baruch did was, to make posters here and there to advertise the Zera Yacob School of Philosophy to the masses, and he ended up attracting a broader audience made up of intellectuals, university teachers, lecturers, journalists, artists, high school students, and so on. And even retired professionals from different disciplines and within the ranks of the government ended up coming to those lectures. And me and others were invited by Baruch and the organizers into giving a series of lectures. And when you attend those classes, you see that you are dealing with individuals from different backgrounds. And since it is not a sort of a rigid environment that is only interested in academic philosophy, rich conversations and dialogues were taking place. And as one example, I can give you one instance where I was defending postmodernism, and there was a heated discussion within the classroom. And I ended up invoking the ideas of Feyerabend, epistemological anarchism. And I challenged the view that science represents the exclusive path to knowledge. And just to see the reactions of the students, I argued that following the ideas of Feyerabend, that as far as the question of method is concerned, anything goes, and that there is no ultimate standard which you could use in order to say that science is more superior compared to witchcraft. And at that instance, one of the students, who I think was a chemistry teacher at a particular university, couldn't control himself and exclaimed that this is a form of stupidity. And all of the students that were attending the class were shocked, but this just shows you to what extent the students were reacting to the kind of ideas that were being discussed, and the discussions were genuine, and different ideas were being debated.
Well, that sounds like a fantastic example of how doing philosophy in the language that people will directly understand is a way of getting people to really feel the problems, right? Of really reacting to them. If you hadn't been presenting it in that sort of way, you wouldn't have got such a strong reaction, and you wouldn't have been able to dealt with those emotive topics in the same sort of way. It sounds like a really fantastic sort of environment, and I guess maybe not only for the students who were able to engage with those ideas in the same way, but perhaps for yourself as well. I mean, I was wondering, how did it feel to be teaching philosophy in Amharic rather than in English, if you're teaching it in English at the university all the time? Did you find it easier to teach in your mother tongue, or was it harder in some ways because it was much less familiar?
I mean, there are both challenges and prospects that are associated with such an attempt. One, when you teach philosophy in Amharic, you become more enthusiastic because you have this way of situating the debates within the daily language, the kind of conversations that are taking place, and also within the cultural values of the people. But the main challenge that sort of arises is the fact that almost all of us, actually all of us, are brought up within this English-dominated system of education. And because of that, even internalizing and translating some of the basic concepts and ideas that are being discussed, that is quite a challenging task. And coming up, for instance, with an Amharic equivalent for primordial matter, the nature of metaphysical being, the Hegelian spirit, and so on, that is quite a challenging task.
Yes, I can absolutely imagine that finding ways to translate Hegelian philosophical terminology into Amharic must be a really tricky one. So I think that, in between you having a chemistry teacher telling you that your epistemology is stupid and having to come up with terms for a Hegelian, philosophical terms, it must have been some real challenges, but it sounds like it was extremely rewarding for you as well.
Yes, definitely it was rewarding. And back in the days, one of those thinkers that made a really huge contribution in terms of trying to translate this difficult English philosophical concepts into Amharic was Professor Masai Kabede. So he was preparing a glossary for Marxist Leninism, and in one of the volumes that he prepared, you have these translations that he has made for some of the difficult concepts, and it is by borrowing on those translations that we get to carry out most of these discussions of philosophy in Amharic.
Ah, that's fascinating then. And that's a really nice point for us to turn to, in that I was wondering whether you could basically give us a short philosophical word list.
Truth, እውነት, mind, አእምሮ, reason, ምክንያት, appearance, መልክ, reality, ቋሚ እውነት፣ ኢተርኒቲ ዘላለማዊነት ኢንፊኒቲ ማለቂያ የሌለው ጋድ ፈጣሪ ጉድ ጥሩ ኢቭል እርኩስ ቢዩቲ ውበት ሶሳይቲ ማህበረሰብ ፊሎሶፊ ፍልስፍና